calm before the storm, they say, literally. So I think it was, the snow was hitting in the southwest and it's going to work its way over here eventually this afternoon, tonight, and tomorrow. But what I like about all the knowledge of weather now is we get these lead-ins, you know. We always get these warnings, and most of the times it's not as bad as what they predict. But then there's that 1 out of 10 times when it's worse than what the weather people say. But so you never know till it happens. But on the other hand, I appreciate you know, some of the technologies we have nowadays. Now, I've been asked to speak about managing your nutrients, your fertilizer applications after a drier than normal year. And it's not unusual for us in this part of the world to have a drier than normal year, or maybe we just had a more normal year. It's hard to say. And the big question is, you know, most of the time, most people fertilize for an anticipated crop. And when that crop does poorly because of drought, and sometimes we get questions when crops are hailed out or froze out early, what happens to the nutrients? That's always a big question. And so I'm going to go through a little bit, and they gave me lots of time. I might get us into lunch early today, so we'll see. But I like the history lesson we got about the St. Mary's and the Milk River. I'd always heard parts of that before, but I really appreciated hearing that. So what about nutrient use on the prairies? You know, your largest check, or now you don't do checks, you do internet transfers or whatever for your crop inputs, but your biggest bill on the farm is your fertilizer bill. And so, you know, when this land was homesteaded, they didn't have fertilizers. They couldn't buy fertilizers. They weren't commercially available. The best my grandfather did was, you know, recycle the livestock manure on a small part of the land. But they actually grew some nice crops because there was this good level of soil organic matter built up in the soils since the last glaciation. And it wasn't until after the Second World War that we started to get some commercial fertilizers available. And the early ones were just, the first fertilizer was 1148 with an elephant on the front. Even I'm old enough that I can remember ripping those bags open. But now it's a lot different. We're using nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and in some areas we need supplementation with micronutrients. Now the soil is an excellent nutrient reservoir, but it's not an infinite supply. Literally, we can grow plants in a hydroponic solution and supply all the nutrient salts. In fact, when I lived in one part of Calgary, I had a next door neighbor. I didn't know, I should have clued on, because he had these funny plywood structures in his backyard and a bunch of pea gravel. And I was sort of clueless, but when the police showed up and raided his garden operation in the basement, which now he could almost do legally, but you know, we can grow plants without soil, but it's a lot of trouble. It takes a lot of management to do it right. And but who knows how many nutrients plants need? I'll lead in livestock and humans. We need 21 elements. So things like iodine and chromium and selenium, and of course we need nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and sulfur. Anybody know how many Animals and humans need 21. How many do plants need? Anybody know? That's really close. There's also hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, and we get those from the air and from water. But these are what we call the mineral nutrients. This is the accepted list. So what you need to realize is every year, every crop you grow uses all these nutrients to grow. Now, thank goodness you don't have to supply all these nutrients to your crop. If you did, your fertilizer bill would be, instead of $70 an acre or $80 an acre, it'd be like $400 an acre. So the soil supplies a lot of these nutrients. Some of them are used in such small amounts that we can probably farm our soils for the next 2,000 years and we won't be supplementing some of these. For example, iron. It's hard on our soils to get iron deficiency. Sometimes under really wet conditions in certain crops it'll come up, but not much. Your crops use almost 10,000 times as much nitrogen as they do copper. But if copper's deficient on a sandy soil, low organic, you might need to supplement a little bit. But thank goodness the soils help us out a lot. So, we're pretty good at what we call the big four, NPKS. And the only reason we worry much about sulfur is because we grow too much canola. Did I say that? Oh, yeah, okay. But it's because of growing canola and, the relative crop of mustard that we've really learned about managing sulfur. And if I go down into parts of Montana where they don't grow any mustard or canola, they hardly know anything about sulfur fertilization because the cereal crops use a lot less. And I'll show you a little bit on that after. So how does the nutrients move from the soil into the plant? There's basically three ways. One is what we call mass flow. The nutrients that are in a form that's soluble in water will move with the water. So that it's mostly nitrogen and sulfur. Then there's what we call diffusion, and that happens really close to the plant roots, right? Just millimeters from the root hairs. And for some of the less mobile nutrients in the soil, it'll move a few millimeters, 1/8 of an inch during the crop year. That's how far some of those nutrients, how slow they move in the soil. But it's vitally important that process works in the soil. And the last one is if the roots actually bump in to the ions in the soil that they absorb. And I like asking questions. Maybe I teach too much, but what percent of your soil, when you grow a crop, let's say a wheat crop, durum wheat crop, what percent of the soil is touched by the roots? Anybody got a guess? Yes. Oh, he's right. So it's 1%, the roots touch 1% of the soil. So basically, at best, they can get 1% of their nutrients by touching where they are. The rest either move a little bit by diffusion or quite a bit with the water in the soil. Now, if it is a nutrient that's mobile in a form, it'll move with the water. It can move up to 3 feet or about 0.9 meters if you're bilingual in imperial and metric. And so it's good to know. Now, if we look at the crops, this shows the basic uptake of the 4 major nutrients by a wheat crop. And I don't know if I got a laser here or not. But the blue line is just the biomass. So don't worry about the blue line, but if you look at this, it shows you that your wheat crops actually absorb the highest color, that light brown or light orange, whatever you want to call it, is potassium uptake. Your wheat crops actually take up more potassium than they do nitrogen. But you put on a lot less potassium fertilizer, if any, on a lot of your soils. And that's because our soils naturally, they're young geologically, and they have quite a bit of available potassium. But some parts of the world, they don't have a lot of. In Brazil, there's a lot of soils, if they don't put a bunch of potash on every year, they don't grow crops. And, so potassium's the highest, then nitrogen, and then down at the bottom is the phosphorus and sulfur. Now this is shown in what we call the elemental form. So it's not P2O5, it's chemically as just the P. And it's interesting because the wheat crop actually uses as much sulfur as it does phosphorus on an elemental basis. And it's good to understand that. We have, in North America, we actually use an old system, the P2O5 system. P2O5 doesn't exist in nature. It's just an old way the chemists used to analyze for phosphorus. And that's not the form that the plants use. They usually actually use phosphate instead. And, but we use just as much sulfur in that crop as we do phosphorus. Now, if we look at canola, it's similar. Potassium's still higher than nitrogen, but most of that, I'll explain what happens. But if you look at the bottom, the light green is sulfur. And we know because we fertilize canola and mustard crops much more with sulfur than we do the cereal crops, they're much higher users of sulfur. And that's because it's needed as part of the proteins in the oil content of those crops. And so if you compare wheat and canola, you can see potassium and nitrogen are quite similar, but the plants actually use about twice as much sulfur as the cereal crops. And for that reason, especially in some parts of Western Canada, we grow so much canola, we really have to look after the sulfur side of things. Now, what about just a regular crop? What happens with these four nutrients? And then I'm finally going to answer your question, what happens after a dry year eventually. But if you look at nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, well, let's just nitrogen and phosphorus first. And this, about 80% of what's taken up into the crop ends up in the grain and is harvested and removed from the, and about 20% stays in the residue and is recycled with the chaff and the straw. Potassium is the other way. About a good 70, almost 80% of it stays in the straw and the chaff, and only about 20% goes off in the grain. So that's another reason why even in the long term, our soils have quite a bit of potassium, and we're recycling the majority of it when we put residues back on the field. For nitrogen and sulfur, we're not. We're packaging it in the grain or in the oil seed, and then we're selling it to somebody, and it's moving off the land. And that's part of the reason why we fertilize more with nitrogen and with phosphorus. So the reality is, we have a lot of improved genetics, higher yield potentials. We have improved cropping systems. We have so much less summer fallow than we used to. If all of a sudden we lost glyphosate, totally, I enjoyed Rob's presentation. If we lost that, and if we didn't have even the contact herbicides to do burn-off before direct no-till seeding, we would start doing more cultivation, and then the reality is we'd conserve less moisture, and we'd have lower yielding crops. It's estimated we're probably getting 15 to 20% higher yields on a lot of our land because of our direct seeding no-till systems in the dry areas. And if all of a sudden we lost that again and we go into a drier cycle, we would see summer fallowing coming back. Now, I know in some places, summer fallow is almost like a swear word. It's a terrible thing, reduces organic matter and everything else. But if things get dry enough, there comes a point where that's the only way you're going to grow crops. You either put it back in grassland or you grow a crop every other year. And that was really reinforced to me once. We think we're dry here, and we are. But I was in, has anybody been to Okanogan, Washington? It's actually south of the Okanagan, but they say the Okanogan is the way you're supposed to say it. They don't call them First Nations down in the States, native area. They own they have a reserve down there. And they're in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains. So on the Seattle side, they get too much rain, but they're in the rain shadow of those big mountains. They average 7 inches of moisture a year. So that's about half. Well, not quite half of what you get right here. And the only way they grow crops is summer fallow crop. And they mostly just grow fallow winter wheat. And so there are times when we need to do things. Now, getting back to nutrients, because we have better crop genetics, we have better improved cropping systems, we're growing higher yielding crops, we need more nutrients. We're exporting more. We're putting more stress on the soil to supply it. So, but there's basically 3 ways that you can manage nutrients. One is on your rented land that you have a short-term lease, you only put on what you need to get next year's crop. Economically, that makes sense. You're not going to, the second one is what we call replacement and building. Maybe you buy a new quarter of land, it hasn't been taken care of all that well. You add sufficient to get the crop, and on some of the nutrients, you'll add extra to build up the capability of that soil to produce good crops. And then the last, you might have a field that's really been looked after well, good crop rotation, good nutrient management in the past, and you only put on what that crop needs because there's a lot of natural nutrient supplying capability in that soil. So basically there's 3 ways you can manage. There's a lot of land that is farmed using the sufficiency method. And it's not a bad method, but can anybody think what would be the disadvantage of only adding what you need for this year's crop? Anybody? I know some of you don't do that. Why do you add extra? Why do you build up your soil? We're a small enough group we can discuss. Okay, Ken said, in case you have a good year, and I can give you a good example of that. I was an agronomist east of Calgary, Strathmore area, and there was one really nice lady we had as a customer. She had moved away from the farm as a child, lived most of her life. When her parents passed away, nobody else in the family wanted to manage the farm, so she manages the farm. Mrs. Regier, great, very knowledgeable, but she comes from an accounting background, and she treated the soil like it was a bank account. Okay, we're going to grow this yield a crop. You're telling me this is what the soil will supply. You got to supply the rest with fertilizer. It was just like money in, money out in a bank account. But soils don't work that way because it worked fine when we had sort of normal years, but we had, do you remember 2013? The best highest crop yields right across the prairie that we've ever had. I don't know if we'll ever get a year like that back. We might. But after that year, instead of growing, I'll just give an example. They were targeting, let's say, 60 bushels wheat. Well, they got 75 bushel wheat. And Mrs. Regier came in and said, Tom, how in the world did I grow a 75 bushel crop of wheat when I only fertilized for a 55 bushel crop? And where did it come from? You know that. You've had better growth years. Where does that extra nutrients come from? Doesn't come from your fertilizer. It's too late to add it. Pardon? Well, yeah, if there's enough air pollution, that's true. Why, when we get those really good years, why are those fields capable of producing that higher yield? Where is it coming from? It's coming from the soil, largely the organic matter in the soil. And so when we get those really good growth years, ample moisture, good temperatures, not too hot, not too cool, that's when it's good condition for the microbes in the soil, and they'll mineralize extra nutrients for us. So that's what I explained to Mrs. Lanier. Now, of course, we do soil testing, we sample. I've done a lot of this in my life, probably a lot more soil sampling than most of you would care to do. And, but, we take samples. There's limitations. Sometimes some people don't trust soil tests. Others trust it too much. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So, soil sampling can help you assess the nutrients that'll be available for the soil, but it's not a perfect science because we're going to have the weather in each year is a little unique, so things will shift around a bit. But it is helpful to know what additional nutrients you need and give you a good indication how much. But a soil test report by itself is not sufficient. To do a good job when I'm working with a farm, I always like to know the cropping history, especially last year's crop, what the fertilizer rates were, what the fertilizer program has been in the past, the grower's approach to nutrient management. Is this that least quarter where I only put on just what I need for this year, or is it one of my long-term fields that I've been taking better care of, so to speak? And you have to have realistic target yields that you're going after. I can remember working with one farmer. He called me up. His name's Steve, but I won't say his last name. Steve called me up and he says, I'm upset at the fertilizer dealer because they wanted to do some soil tests. I wanted a recommendation. They wouldn't give me one if I wouldn't give them a target yield. And he says, I don't know what the hell the yield's going to be this year because every year's different. And I said, I had to explain to him. I says, no, Steve, they know your yield's going to vary a bit because of the weather, but they're just trying to anticipate what you're going to need. So I actually went on his farm. He had 20 fields. I literally sampled all 20 fields, did all the analyses, and then talked with him about it. And I explained to him, all the target yields is a goal. And yet a lot of that is controlled by the weather. If we get a too dry year, you're not going to get that. If we get a better year, you're going to get slightly higher. And after we were all done, actually, he started believing me after I'd done all his land. There were 3 fields close to his small feedlot. And he says, I still don't think soil testing works. And I said, I'll call them fields 1, 2, and 3. Close to the feedlot, in between, and then farther away. I said, Steve, you put manure on field 1 every year, don't you? And he says, yeah. And I says, some years you've had extra manure and you put it on field 2, right? Yes. And I says, you've never put manure on field 3. No. How did you know that? And I said, because of the phosphorus levels in the soil. Then he started believing me on the recommendations on the rest of the farm. So when we do soil sampling, the first thing we did is we physically take the sample, we analyze it in the lab, we get the results and interpret them, and then we come up with a recommendation. Now, I trust most of you, when you get a recommendation, you look at it and then you use your common sense, right? Do you follow those recommendations exactly? Not that often, I don't think. You usually make some adjustments based on your knowledge and experience on your farm. And usually we apply the nutrients, and if your agronomist isn't doing it for you, your paid agronomist, they should give you an accounting from your yield maps that you have, how good did their recommendation and your final decision work on the field. So I see doing a nutrient management as 6 steps. So, we sample different depths. The 0 to 6 tells us about 80% of the story, but there are times when knowing what's in that 6 to 12 inch or 6 to 24 inch can tell us more of what's going on. The deeper sampling gives us a lot more knowledge about nitrogen, sulfur, boron, and chloride, whereas the surface sample, for most of the others, phosphorus, potassium, a lot of the micronutrients, is sufficient. But I'm leading up to what I'm going to tell you. So what they do in the soil test labs is they take your soil sample, they treat it with some chemicals, and then they measure the soluble nutrients. And then the results are correlated with research that's been done in the area. And so that's how they come up with the recommendation. This many parts per million in the soil test probably means this many pounds per acre in the soil, but if your target yield's here, then you need to add more to get to that target yield. So a lot of you are, probably familiar with seeing soil test results. They give you the numbers, and then there's usually the second part is they come up with recommendations. This used to be ALS Labs out of Saskatoon. They quit doing agriculture soil samples because they were making too much money in the oil and gas reclamation industry. Maybe now they might wish they were doing ag samples again, but they were good because they always gave 3 situations. One was drier than normal, and wetter than normal. And actually, I liked that procedure because then, depending on where you were, a drier year, drier cycle, normal, wetter cycle, you could adjust your fertilizer rates. So now that I've talked for 25 minutes, I'll finally answer the question. So you had a drier than normal crop year. Can this year's crop scavenge all last year's residual nutrients? In most cases, yes, but it depends on what nutrients and the weather that happens after that water deficient crop, what happened to the moisture during harvest, after harvest, through the fall, through the winter, through the spring, coming up to the next crop. Because, for example, down in Ontario, where how many people sample in the fall? Have soil sampling done in the fall? Most of you. How many sample in the spring? A little bit. The research people do, yeah. In Ontario, they never sample in the fall. It's a waste of time. They get so much rain and precipitation through the winter, their soil can show 50 pounds of nitrogen in the fall. By the time they get to spring, that 50 pounds is gone because of all the precipitation, leaching, gas losses. And so a lot depends. Now, if you don't remember anything else today, this is a useful chart I have for, this shows the mobility of the nutrients that plants use both in the soil and in the plant. Now, I'm going to concentrate on the soil one today, but for example, I'm just going to talk about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur to save time here, but nitrogen in the nitrate form, which is about 90% of what the plant takes up is nitrate, it's very mobile in the soil. It'll move with the water. It can move up to almost a 1.2, well, 2 meters or 4 feet in the water in a year. The plant can use water that far sometimes. And plants will also use ammonium N, but because it has a positive charge, it's like the cations, it'll stick to the clay particles and move really slowly in the soil. The only crop I know that uses lots of ammonium is rice, because it's growing in water. And the ammonium is more mobile in the water. But our crops, whether you put on anhydrous ammonia or urea, most of it gets changed over to nitrate, and that's what the plants you take up through their roots. Phosphorus is very, very less mobile in the soil. It's estimated from a granule of 1152 that it'll move 1/4 of an inch in the crop year. That's how far the phosphorus moves in the soil, most soils. Sandy soils that move maybe up to an inch, heavy clay, maybe 1/8 of an inch. Loam soils about 1/4 of an inch. And potassium, it's less mobile, but it'll move up to about 4 to 5 inches in a crop year. And sulfur, it gets changed over to sulfate form, or it's already in the sulfate form. It'll move through the soil almost as well as nitrogen. So there's big differences. And because of those differences, that's why you side band your phosphorus or put it in the seed row. Because if you did mid-row banding of phosphorus, this year crop is not going to see much of that phosphorus. Now, if you're always mid-row banding, you're going to have, unless you're doing, even if you have controlled traffic, you're going to often plant in between rows if you're that precise. But you have old bands of phosphorus that the crop will use. Now, another question for you. What percentage of the phosphorus you put on this year is used by this year's crop? Anybody got an idea? What were you supposed to get in school to pass a test? At least when if you got under 50, it wasn't too good. If you got over 50, well, at least you passed. And I remember in grade 10 math, I got 55, so I passed, and they let me go on to the next course. And I did better the next years. But how much of your phosphorus fertilizer you put on this year is going to make it into this year's crop? Any idea? You said 30? What'd you say? 50? It's actually probably at best about 20 to 25%. And now the environmentalists, they see that and they go berserk. They go, you're putting on this phosphorus fertilizer, and it's a little bit of soluble phosphorus that ends up in Lake Winnipeg, and that's why I can't go swimming outside my cottage anymore, because of you farmers putting phosphorus fertilizer on the soil. And they say, you put it on and the crop only uses 25%, so that means 75% ends up at my cottage in Lake Winnipeg. That's not accurate at all. that phosphorus fertilizer, it moves so slowly in the soil, yeah, we may only get, let's say, 20% into this year's crop, but this year's crop is using phosphorus that was put on a fertilizer for the last 15 years. All of that is contributing to this year's crop. The reality is it's hard to lose phosphorus from the soil. If you leave it on the surface, spread manure on frozen soil on snow, a lot of that phosphorus will go off in the runoff. But once you put it into the soil, it's hard to lose it from the soil. It's estimated in the long term, phosphorus fertilizer is 95% efficient. With our nitrogen fertilizer, at best, we're maybe getting 75% efficient. All that nitrogen you put on, reality is about 20% of it is either leached or gassed off. It's just the way nitrogen is. It's very reactive in the environment. Now that I made you feel good about nitrogen, so nitrogen is more subject to loss. It can be leached or it can be denitrified and go back into the air, mostly as dinitrogen gas. You know, nitrous oxide is one of the greenhouse gases, and so environmentally on agriculture, they point the finger at us and say, you know, you put that nitrogen fertilizer on and then you're contributing to nitrous oxide. How much of nitrous oxide air pollution is because of agriculture? Anybody got an idea? If you're ever asked by some of your urban relatives, at most, we're half the problem. The other half of the problem is the transportation and industry, nitrous oxide going off from combustion engines and so forth. So we do have some losses of nitrogen. Phosphorus is hard to lose, very hard to lose. And potassium, very low losses. And sulfur, it can be lost, but mostly just on sandy soils if we have leaching. Now, I need to finish and leave some time for questions. So what happened to the nutrients you put on last year that weren't used? The phosphorus, the potassium, if you used it, and the sulfur are still in the soil. Unless you got a really sandy soil and you had a lot of leaching. Now, a really sandy soil under irrigation, you can get a little bit of leaching, even of phosphorus. Not much. It's hard even under irrigation. But some of the nitrogen, if you had heavy rains after the crop, through the winter, and if we get some wet period here, some of that residual nitrogen could end up back in the atmosphere. And that's because the bacteria in the soil need oxygen to live. Most of the time, if the soil isn't too wet, they use oxygen that filters down and through the air. But if it gets too wet, the first thing they go after is the oxygen on the nitrate. That's their first choice of oxygen. And it's estimated under our condition that 1% of the nitrogen we apply goes off back to the atmosphere as nitrous oxide. In Ontario, wetter conditions, 5% of the nitrogen they put on approximately goes off as nitrous oxide. So we have quite low losses. We're not big contributors on that side. But so often questions I get, okay, I soil sampled in the fall, I had this residual nitrogen, or I sampled in the spring to check my fields because I had a wet fall and spring. Did I lose it? How much fertilizer do I need to add? So on your phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, I would say just fertilize like you normally do. The only one you really need to worry about if it's there's much residual left is the nitrogen side. And it's hard sometimes when you go after a dry year, you sample, and then I've looked at reports and people will call me up and they'll say, it says I have 60 pounds of nitrogen residual in the soil. And I usually only put on 80 pounds of nitrogen with my crop. So does that mean I only put 20 pounds on? How would you answer that? Have you ever had that situation? What did you do? What do you think I tell them? Most people will not go into a crop. They'll fertilize more than 20 acres. Now, it's not that the nitrogen's not there, but on a risk, they're saying, what if I get better growing conditions, and if I only put 20 pounds, yeah, the soil test says there's 60 there, but often what they'll do, instead of putting on the 80, they may put on 50. Okay, so it's a decision you have to make. And I find most of the time, I admit if it was my field and I only needed 80 because I'm in a drier area, the soil test says I have 60, I'm probably not going to rely on just 20. I'm going to put maybe at least 40 on, just in case I get that better growth year. So it's not that the nitrogen's not there. The soil test is fairly accurate on nitrogen, but it's a decision that you have to. I find those, when you have those high residual levels, can I rely on that? And most people compromise. Okay, I've got residual nitrogen. I won't fertilize my normal rate, but I'm not going to go down to 20. But you're getting my opinion on that. So with that, I'd like to stop and entertain any questions you have. Yes?
Yeah, Tom, just a quick thing on the mobilization, so you want to comment on that, then you've got a lot less residue above ground, below ground, residue going back into the system, just the mobilization, how that affects dynamics as well.
Yeah, when we have a high yielding crop, we've got a lot of residue. The residue tends to be high in carbon, low in nitrogen. So initially the microbes need nitrogen from the soil to break that down, and often the crop will use out. But then we've got old residues from the last 3 years that are decomposing. Often that sort of balances out. And we used to really worry about trying to figure that all out, and then we sort of found out that it sort of balanced out in the end. And so we soil test, this is what's in the soil, 30 pounds. I need 100 on my irrigated land to grow the crop I want, so I'm going to add 70. Does that help? Okay.
Out of all the crops that are out there, which is the one, if you were to have land that you will not be farming next year, what would be the crop? My favorite most nutrient of this crop.
So your question is, which crop wouldn't use a lot of nutrients?
No, wood.
Well, would use a lot.
That wouldn't have
Well,
been very,
good at scavenging the nutrients.
yeah, and then it's your last year with crop.
Yeah, if you've got lots of residual and then moisture are looking good, actually they're all pretty good. Maybe flax isn't as, although even flax is pretty good at pulling nutrients. The crops are pretty good at pulling nutrients out. And cereals are probably a little more efficient than the pulse crops, and canola's a little better than the cereals, if you get enough moisture for it to grow. That's the thing. Mustard's pretty good at pulling nutrients out. Yeah. I better leave some time for the next speaker, right? Okay.